Last time we introduced you to emotion, and today we're going to talk about measuring emotion. How do we measure it? Well, we can simply ask people how do they feel, because remember, emotions are feelings. That's called self-report. The problem with that, it's difficult for people to describe what their feelings are, and it's very difficult for us to quantify these self-reports. So the next level is using a Likert scale. So we might ask, how angry are you on a 5-point scale? So we actually have a quantitative measure of their emotion by using a Likert scale. We can also use galvanic skin response, a physiological measure of emotion. If you are emotional, if you are aroused, and remember arousal is a key part of what we mean by motivation, of emotion, then it'll actually increase the perspiration on the skin. That's one of those physiological responses to arousal. And we can measure that, and it's very precise. Galvanic skin response, usually measured on a finger. We can use a polygraph, which is what we use to tell whether people are lying or not. Well, some people believe that, even though it's not reliable. I'll show you that. We can use facial expression, actually look at the facial expression that the person has, which we talked about is a very good measure of emotional response, and we'll actually show you some data on that now. Or we can use brain imaging and new techniques which are telling us how people are responding to emotional states in the amygdala, for example. Now, the polygraph is pretty good at detecting guilt. For example, it detects guilt about 76% of the time. But it has, remember we talked about signal detection theory? It has a horrible false alarm rate. For example, in this study done by Kleinmuntz and Zuko, they actually took 100 people, 50 who had confessed of a crime, so we know they're guilty, and 50 people that were proved innocent by a court, and we gave them to a polygraph examiner. They had no idea what group they were testing. And while the innocent were judged to be innocent only about 65% of the time, and about 38% of the time, they were judged to be guilty. That's a horrible false alarm rate, not that good of a hit rate. If they were guilty, the people that we know they did the crime because they confessed to it, and these are theft crimes, then we got about 78% said they're guilty. But again, 30% or so, really 29% or so, said they were innocent. So it's just not a reliable measure that we can use in detecting lying or their degree of arousal. There's some new methods which are much more promising, even though they're not being used now. Well, some of them are. For example, there's a guilty knowledge test, which is a polygraph test, but the reaction to crime scene are reactions to evidence that only known by the police. If they show arousal to something which has not been in the press and only known by the police and thus only known by the person that's guilty, then reaction to that is much more reliable evidence for lying than just looking at the polygraph talking about questions that are not related to information that they wouldn't know if they were innocent. Also, Paul Ekman actually trains police to look at people when they're being interrogated for changes in facial expression while they're lying. Like they'll change their rate of blinking. They will change the way in which they respond with their face. While this is sort of in progress, it's a new method, Paul Ekman, who studied facial expressions more than probably anybody else, has been using that and actually training police and other officials to use this technique. And then Michael Gazzaniga, who we talked about when we talked about split brains, a very, very famous neuroscientist, is actually using fMRI, functional magnetic resonance imaging, to identify criminals by the way in which their parts of their brain react to the questions that are being asked. It's promising. They say it's not quite ready for court use yet, but it's a very promising technique that's being developed currently for looking at measuring emotion. Now, I mentioned that facial expressions are an important part of emotional states. And there's some evidence that they're universal. That is, that all humans use these facial expressions. Data to support that? Well, even very young infants, toddlers, show identifiable facial expressions for joy, anger, disgust, surprise, sadness, and fear. If I showed you pictures of these children, you would immediately know that they were sad, or they were happy, or they had disgust. Also, the fact that identification of facial emotional expressions is similar across cultures. This is the work of Paul Ekman. And there's also especially high agreement among different cultures. Even the natives of New Guinea, who are really not exposed to other cultures, show very high agreement for happiness and disgust. Here is Ekman's data, for example, for the ability to detect the correct emotion for happiness in the United States, in Brazil, in Chile, in Argentina, where our new Pope comes from, Japan, and even New Guinea. While it's not as high as the others, it's still close to above 80% agreement. So this cross-cultural comparisons gives us evidence that facial expressions are universal, and we all have the same facial expressions. There's also the fact that facial expressions are identical between sighted and blind individuals, ones that wouldn't really be exposed to facial expressions in their early years. Let's look at a video that actually shows that. One theory actually says that we actually can get feedback from our own facial expressions that will affect our emotional state. It's called the facial feedback hypothesis by Tompkins. What Tompkins did is say that the facial expression itself can produce emotion in the individual having the facial expressions. Many studies have shown that having subjects actually contract the muscles identical to the way they're contracted in various emotional states, like contracting the muscles that are important for happiness or sadness, eyebrows, muscles in the cheeks, and mouth, actually led to feelings similar to those emotions. So this is sort of a feedback hypothesis, not only that the emotion will produce these facial expressions, but engaging in the facial expressions will actually produce the feeling in the individuals. Another thing you need to know about facial expressions is that we can distinguish between the natural emotional expression, the one that's produced by actual feelings, and ones that are feigned. Like posing for photography, you want to smile. That's a different smile than you would have if you're smiling naturally. So another example of how important facial expressions are for understanding emotion. Finally, I want to talk about some work by David Myers, a psychologist, that said, you want to be happier? That's the emotional state we want to have. What do you have to do? What does research tell us? What does science tell us on what we need to do to be a happier person? First, happiness does not come from financial success. Financial stability and happiness are not correlated with each other. Take control of your time. That's an important part of being a happy person. Act happy. We've also shown that facial expressions can produce the emotional state, so act like you're happy. Work and leisure should engage your skills. You need to be doing something that you like. Like almost every other psychological state, aerobic exercise is important. Exercise produces good feelings in us. Get plenty of sleep. Give priority to close relationships, the people that we are close to. Focus beyond yourself. That is, doing good actually makes you feel good. And keep a gratitude diary. This is what Myers proposes, where you write down every day things that made you feel good. So thank you.